Hello, very beautiful community. Welcome to this chat about Biden pardoning his son, Hunter. This will not be a 2-3 minute take. This will be a bit of an exploration about our crisis of democracy and about ethics. So we'll probably be here for at least a quarter of an hour. Strap yourselves in. It's lovely to see you. I wasn't there yesterday. I normally like to be with you on a Sunday, but for health reasons, I couldn't even do a short talk from bed. So delighted to see you today. And we will get to specifics, but allow me to start broadly because we have to say a little bit about conflicts within the breast. Now, throughout the history of your culture, and that is your culture in the case of 97% of you watching, there has been a tendency throughout the history of the Western world, there has been a tendency to say one of two things. The first thing is that values are fundamentally compatible. You might experience the perception of a conflict between values, but actually that's because you haven't understood the values at hand properly. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would say that if only you understood the values of equality and liberty properly, you would see that there couldn't be a conflict between them. The issue isn't in the values, it's in the flawed understanding of the values that postulates a conflict that actually can't be there. Now that thought is a minority thought throughout the history of the West, but it's an important thought. It persists. And it still colors a lot of how ordinary thought goes for us. But a more common thought is to say, look, values do conflict, but it's possible to ascertain general principles, if not a general formula, for arbitrating that conflict. Which means that you don't say that values don't get in each other's way, but you say that when they do, you can sort of rank and organize them properly in accordance with some general principles. And so somebody might say that a utilitarian approach could get you to that conclusion. Somebody else might say that a Kantian approach could get you to that conclusion, which would say, look, values clash, but we can ascertain principles of right and justice that would trump value conflict and guide us about how to arbitrate and rank it. And what I want to say is that both of these two very dominant thoughts, they're thoughts that sit in us quite deeply. Right? Even if we don't think these thoughts, we quarter think them somewhere inside us, right? These two thoughts are errors. Values do clash, and there is no general way of ranking them when they do. Let's take a little example that the public intellectual John Gray sometimes gives via his friend Isaiah Berlin. And it's a story of a World War II British official having a typing pool of perhaps 20 people and having strong evidence that one of them was leaking to the enemy. So the choice was to keep everybody because you couldn't discover who was doing it, or fire everybody. Now, firing everybody would mean that 19 people out of 20 unjustly lose not just this job, but potentially future employability and livelihood. And so what's that conflict there? Well, the conflict there is a conflict between justice and something like national security. And the choice that this official made was to prioritize national security and fire the entire typing pool, which got rid of the person leaking secrets, but it also got rid of 19 people who did nothing wrong and have been in a long distance way punished for wrongs they had nothing to do with. So when you resolve a conflict of values like that, there is always huge residue, there is always huge loss, right? And you feel that loss in the phenomenological perception of a moral pool in the opposite direction to the choice that you've made, even if you feel that that choice is right. And we often talk about reasons for action not going away just because they are outweighed. So we want to normalize the idea of conflicts of value which entail irreparable loss, even when you make a choice that feels contingently right for you. Having done this briefly, let's go on. I think there are two reasons why Biden pardoned Hunter. So that's a bit of a step into Biden's psychology. Number one, it's not so much the feeling I'm dad here, this is my son, this is my mentally unwell son. It's the son is being pursued and will be pursued in the future because of my career ambitions. It's because I am president that Hunter is in trouble. Now, we could say a few things in response to that about how Hunter benefited from Biden being president, but we're trying to reconstruct Biden's feelings here, and a strong feeling is, this is on me. I pursued a career that put my son in a certain situation, so I've got to fix it for him now. That's the first element. The second element is these are not normal times. So maybe I wouldn't do this under other conditions. But these are not normal times. And so you have to suspend, right, the kinds of standards that would normally apply. So these are not normal times, above all because you are likely to have a Trump administration bent on revenge and with a particular kind of obsession with Hunter Biden. And I can't stand for that. Moreover, our democracy is becoming a bit of a shit show anyway, and my legacy has become a bit of a shit show because I was the I'll protect the country from Trump candidate, and I delivered the country to Trump. So my legacy, even though I'm still proud of it, and I'm still proud of some of my policy achievements if I'm Biden, I did compromise my legacy by sort of walking the country, or partly walking the country, into a second Trump term. So my legacy is at shit show, the country is at shit show, we're going to have an administration obsessed with my son and bent on revenge. So this is what not normal times means, right? You've got Kash Patel being pushed for the FBI. So I'm sorry, but we've got to do it. Now let's say a word about how Biden experienced this decision. We talked about conflict within the breast. Did Biden sit there agonizing for a long time about the damage done, which we'll discuss briefly, to U.S. democracy, on the one hand, and then protecting his baby on the other hand? And I think no, this wasn't agonizing for Biden. Biden was conscious of the hit that U.S. democracy takes with this. He didn't feel it's a massive hit, but he thought it was a notable hit. Sort of a small-ish hit, but a hit. But he didn't feel, oh my, this is agonizing that I'm going to do something damaging to our democracy. He just thought, bullshit, I have to do this and I'm going to do it. And he didn't agonize over it because of a long distance accustomization to power. And it's that very accustomization to power that actually led Biden into the hubris of indecision around staying or going for a second term, and eventually feeling that he would stay. So he didn't agonize too much about this, actually, because he in the end bullishly felt, screw this, I've got to do it. And yes, there is a downside for US democracy, but I'm so used to power, I'm such a big boy, that it's normal for me to take decisions with, negative residue, and this is going to be one more such decision. How will this impact US democracy? Well, let's not dramatize it, but it's bad politics, which is to say it hurts the Democrats, and it's bad for democracy. It hurts not the party, but the country too. It's a bad precedent. It's going to be harder to criticize Trump's future pardons, and it further undermines the argument Biden made, I feel wrongly actually, which the Harris campaign at first challenged but then gave into, about how democracy was on the ballot against Trump. Now, of course, it's also worth bearing in mind that there's a remarkable history of presidential pardons that can look, eyebrow-raising. Just Google up Jimmy Carter's pardons. So we shouldn't get this out of proportion. There's a history of presidents doing things of this kind, which means that we shouldn't be scandalized by it, even if we think it's wrong. And the damage to US democracy that this does is minor relative to a president who wasn't open about his cognitive decline and wanted to run for a second term, or is minor compared to the damage the West takes in its politics of retreat in the Middle East as events in Gaza happen, for example, right? Absolutely humanly devastating and shocking events, for which Biden is at least ethically responsible. So there is big stuff out there that would take up our discussion, right, about what's problematic about the Biden administration. Another thing that's really problematic is that Biden, while being a more efficacious president and a more progressive president than Obama, Biden never managed to articulate a vision for the country that could make sense of his policy. So even his better policies were pushed through in a context of sort of opaque disorientation for most of the citizenry. So they may have practically landed, but they didn't civically land. And of course, we might say that the power to pardon may need to be amended. How does this affect the ordinary voter, allowing for the fact that this isn't going to be a huge effect? And I think that it does so by making them feel even more deeply that institutions are irrevocably corrupted. And I want to talk about two ways in which that might be felt. And the first is the feeling that because this sense of corrupt institutions goes with a sense of opacity about these institutions, that they don't make sense to you anymore, you can't see them properly. And because that goes with a conspiratorial flavor, and because a conspiratorial flavor always goes with the idea that what really matters is the thing you can't see, it plays into not just distrust, therefore, but distrust descending into conspiracy. And the second thing you've got to understand is that distrust begets distrust, just like trauma begets trauma. So one bit of distrust rolls into another, and so on, rapidly. And I think that the feelings of distrust around the pardon will roll into many citizens' perception of the Kamala project, which to very many, if not most, US citizens will now look more like a sort of inauthentic, artificial, Politburo-style construct rather than a real candidate. And here the blame would be directed to the party rather than the woman. When millions of Americans feel that there was something really artificial about Kamala Harris, the candidate, they don't necessarily feel animosity toward her. You see a lot of really unlovely animosity toward Kamala, who just did her very best, quite frankly. But there isn't, in the end, that kind of animosity toward Kamala there is toward Hillary Clinton. So when there is this perception that she is a political construct rather than a genuine democratic phenomenon and a real three-dimensional candidate, that's because of the way she was constrained within her role, not because she's an individual well despising the way Hillary Clinton is for many Americans. I'm not recommending that view. I myself actually feel somewhat protective of Hillary Clinton despite her combination of sort of hyper-competence and hyper-intelligence with deep delusion about her country. And I feel that a lot of Hillary's hardness is actually a product of trauma. So I feel protective of Hillary. I'm not endorsing this sort of viscerally negative attitude to her, but it's there. I'm just describing it. So I think that it just makes the whole post-Biden transition process look more artificial. That's an effect of this pardon for many Americans. Now let's say that we have already done what this does to Biden's legacy, right? Which is not that much, but a bit. But the bigger issues around the legacy are foreign policy, and then the lack of an articulation of his domestic project, and then the lack of communication around his cognitive decline, and the hubris and the sort of commodiousness with power that led him to not step aside earlier. Perhaps one thing I would give him, even though it also contains a downside, is nuclear risk management. Biden has been extraordinarily responsible at making sure the world doesn't descend into global nuclear war. And I say that as somebody who is critical of the caution the Biden administration showed in the context of Ukraine, where we are talking about nuclear risk. We're not talking about nuclear risk in the Middle East. So that's one thing I'd give in Biden's favor, but again, with a certain kind of qualification that is to do with this wider pattern of US, the deglobalization of the US empire. Now, what about this question? What if Biden had done the pardon, but done it differently? And perhaps there are three remarks we can make here. The first is, what if he did it without the rationalization? What if he did it without the rationalization of how this was the democratically right thing to do? But he just said, I have the privilege of this power, and the right decision for me today is to use it to give protection to my son, because whatever trouble he has got into, he will be pursued in the future by Trump, and I've got to protect him. So that's different to the rationalization of how this is anyway good for democracy, because everything about the pursuit of Hunter is a political conspiracy against him. as a way of attacking me. And you can buy that up to a point, but you can't buy that to the extent that Biden puts it in the pardon. So what if there was no rationalization? He just owned the call. I'm protecting my son here, right? I'm not going to give you siren songs about how this also happens to be good for democracy, but it's bad for democracy, Joe. The second possibility is beyond my remit of expertise, and that's what if he'd given a delimited pardon? That's to say, keeping on the books what Biden has already been charged with and not clearing that, but preemptively clearing future Trumpist attacks on Hunter that haven't happened yet. And the third element would be to accompany this pardon with many more pardons of others for non-violent crimes. Now, how do we think about the Trump voter here who is outraged by this? Well, I won't give you a lecture about engaging civically and constructively, even if the other side is not constructive. Let me just say that, Trump has already spoken about forgiving Jan 6 folks. And if we look at the pardons Trump's already done, Biden's pardon of Hunter is not going to look among the worst of them, arguably. So there is a kind of dynamic here of unilateral nihilism in the way the Trump folks engage. That's to say, they do not hold themselves to the standards they hold Democrats to, but they expect Democrats to hold themselves to their own standards, even though the Trump folks don't hold themselves to these or arguably any other standards either. So there's a kind of a unilateral nihilism where the hypocrisy of the other side keeps being pressed and exposed without any hypocrisy on one side, on the Trumpist side, because no standards are being applied there at all. And that's a frustrating dynamic, but you've got to live with it politically. Let's land ourselves with a bit of a moral remark. And that's that there are two questions. Should Biden have done it? And should a US president have done it, whether they're Biden or not? And I think these are separate questions, actually. And that's for the reason that there is another principle I want to introduce. Having introduced the principle of a kind of value pluralism early on, where we said that values conflict and you can't resolve that conflict with a general formula. Now I want to say something else that we already mentioned in the Russian propaganda video. And that's that there is a certain motivational internality, right? We talked about how Russian propaganda starts with what already motivates you. And what I want to say is that you can't say that somebody has a reason to do X unless there's already something inside their head that motivates them, that aligns with doing X. If there is nothing like that in their head, what you can say is that maybe they should do X, but they don't have a reason to. So in practice, you could say an example might be, because Donald Trump is a narcissist, he should care about other people, but being a narcissist, he has no reason to care about other people. And so this might land us into a point whereby we might argue that Biden should have not pardoned his son. We could make that argument. I'll say more about that in a moment. But you can't say that Biden had overwhelming reasons to not pardon his son. Because for Biden, these reasons just weren't overwhelming. Because it was completely clear to him that he had to do it. That was his experience of it, because it meant owning the impact of his career on his son's life, recognizing the fragility of his son, and then saying, look, we don't live in normal times. And that means it's okay. The hell with it, I'm going to do it. This is clear for me. So Biden was coming from that place. And that only got strengthened by his psychology and his family history. A tragic family history that makes him feel that family comes unqualifiedly first. Right? So he is a good dad. Being a good dad can make you a worse president. Conflicts of values. But for Biden, this was so clear that we can't say that he had a reason to do otherwise. That was overwhelming, because then we'll be saying that Biden should be somebody who he isn't, and I don't love that way of talking about it. So if you want to say a different decision needed to be made, the best way to say it is, it would have been good if we had a president who wasn't Biden. So let's talk about that for a moment. Would I have done it, or would I have not done it? Well, I actually can't answer that question, because I can't imagine being in politics. That's for personal reasons, right? I don't love connection with political process the way politicians do. I don't love power the way high-flying politicians do. I love observing politics, but contact with politics doesn't thrill me, and it's not a need of mine any more than golf is a need of mine. Plus, moreover, I'm a philosopher, and I'm a baby public intellectual, and that's what I love. Plus, with high power, the degree of destruction you have to wreak, and the lives you take, as Barack Obama, for instance, did on Tuesdays with his drone program, is something that in me would occupy, it wouldn't destabilize me, interestingly, but it would occupy a much bigger space in my head than the space that would be proportionate for somebody in high power. You have to very, very, very quickly absorb human destructiveness and have your morning smoothie and get on with the day. That's not a fit for me. So therefore, I can't say it about me either, right? I would have to be somebody else to give that answer with a yes or a no. So what I want you to do in the comments is tell me what you would do, or what the kind of president you want to have would do. Meanwhile, I'm only going to give you one principle. I'm tempted to say that we want a president who wouldn't pardon their son, but with this qualification. That if we have a president who prioritizes democracy over family, I don't want a president who prioritizes democracy over family in a remotely rapid or easeful way. I want a president who is very strongly tempted to prioritize their child over democracy, even if in the end they don't. Lots and lots of love.